I'm joined once again by my colleague Erica Molesworth, who will be helping moderate today's event. The program is brought to you by the Computational Culture Lab in the School of Art and Design at the Australian National University in Canberra. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the land of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, whose sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that the quest for self-determination and substantive rights by our First Nation colleagues and their communities remains critically urgent, particularly in the aftermath of the recent Australian referendum. Now, we've had some fantastic talks over the last few weeks. We kicked off with Hito Stahl's great keynote introducing the idea of subprime images and thinking about kidnapped data and the political economy of images that inform current data-intensive practices. We've had panels following that exploring the future of the commons in an age of extractive AI with respect to issues of community and Indigenous data sovereignty. We then did a detour into the question of how cultural institutions and their ways of working with digital technologies are quite limited, and then what the risks are in beginning to think through AI in the art museum, and whether, circling back to Hito's opening keynote, the artists and the institution risks being an onboarding tool for big tech. And then last week, we moved into the world of artist practices, thinking about the way in which bodies are tracked, monitored and surveilled and classified both outside and inside the art institution, and looked at the way in which different artists are beginning to open up the black box of AI and think through different methods through which one can encounter the current AI imaginaries and speak to them with the public. So that leads us to our final keynote with the wonderful James Bridle. But before I introduce James, I just wanted to give a few housekeeping notes. You'll notice that we're not running this in webinar mode, which means we can all enjoy each other's company and presence. However, this means we've muted all your mics in this first part to avoid sensory overload. We are recording this event. If you'd like to remain anonymous, please change your name and keep your camera off. James will be talking for around 45 minutes or longer, at which point we will have time for questions, and we have activated the Q&A module to manage this. So please help us by submitting your questions there rather than in the chat, and it will be active during their talk. When it comes to Q&A time, you'll have the opportunity to unmute and ask James your question. Please append to your question if you'd prefer us to ask them on your behalf, if you are still in your pajamas on the other side of the world. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce James Bridle. James is an artist, writer, and technologist based in Greece. And many of you will have been following their work since 2011, when their research on the new aesthetic gained global attention, spurring debate and creative responses on the migration of digital aesthetics into physical space. Since then, James's writing on art, politics, culture, and technology has appeared on numerous platforms, from The Guardian to Frieze. And their work has been commissioned and exhibited worldwide by numerous institutions, from MoMA, the Barbican, ZKM to the Serpentine. And most significantly, perhaps, they are the author of two brilliant books, New Dark Age from 2018 and Ways of Being from 2022. James also wrote and presented the series New Ways of Seeing for BBC Radio 4 in 2019, which I also highly recommend. Thank you so much, James, for joining us, and please take over our screens.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've known Katrina for quite a long time now, and she's always been incredibly supportive of my work. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to see her again and to speak to all of you. So good morning or good evening, as is appropriate. Yes, let's share some screens. Katrina, can you nod if that's worked? Great. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I was going to talk a bit today about AI, obviously, but really about trying to broaden um, questions what we're talking about when we talk about AI and intelligence, and a little bit about what it means for artistic practice as well. Really in my own work, because I quite often give talks that kind of lay out a lot of the stuff from the book, and I'll do a bit of that. But I also want to talk a bit about where it can go, where as art practitioners and institutions we can actually take some of those ideas and do stuff with them. Um, uh, I I've worked with AI for quite a long time, in the sense that I did, my academic background was in computer science and cognitive science, 20 years ago now, in what was the sort of the dying days of the last wave of AI. Um, uh, Although it's striking that there's not a lot of difference. It was mostly about neural nets back then, and I actually wrote my dissertation on like artistic uses of AI. Could AI be creative? Could it generate images? Could it make music? All of these things, which it could a bit and really badly back then. Um, it's obviously got better at doing those things, but it remains striking to me that 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 not a lot has changed in that regard. By which I mean there's been no major um, breakthroughs in how we think about what AI might be, or how it might be. There have been sort of technical breakthroughs in terms of like faster chips and certain like clever algorithms and so on and so forth. But in the last 20 years, the main thing that has produced the current wave of AI has not been a technological breakthrough or a reimagining of what AI might be. Uh, that imagination goes back to the sort of connectionism of the 1950s and 60s. What's made it possible is money and power. Um, as I think you've probably discussed in previous lectures, the acquisition of vast amounts of data by a few large corporations, and their ability to build very powerful computers to process that data and put it to use. I don't really want to go into all of that too much. I think you have already. We can in the Q&A. I want to talk a bit more about the kind of affect of AI, what we think about it, and how we might think about it differently. This is on the screen now as a work from a few years ago, where I built my own self-driving car, or parts of it. I trained my own self-driving car. I taught a car to drive, and I did a few things with that. And this was a deliberately AI project. It was a project in which I wanted to engage with a machine learning system, see what it felt like, get a feeling of the grain, and see how like artistically I could do stuff with that, and particularly to do it as a collaborator rather than as the controller of this system. I wanted to see what it felt like to collaborate with a learning system. One of the outcomes of that was this thing on screen, which is an artwork called Autonomous Trap, um, which is a trap for self-driving vehicles. It's a solid circle and a dashed circle, which in Europe corresponds to the road markings for no entry. So when the vehicle drives in, it can't leave. Um, this work developed, though, even though it seems like quite an aggressive work, it developed from a desire to find a shared sensory space with the system, right? I was treating this thing as a collaborator. I was attributing it agency. Um, Different discussion about whether it has those things, but I was choosing to attribute it to them in this case to see what happened. And one of the things I learned about was what its senses were like, how it saw the world, what its like perspective on the world was. One of the things I learned quite quickly, which seems obvious, but it's very interesting to see how it emerges in the system, is that it has, a particular visual frequency range that mostly is focused on lines on roads, right? And that's interesting because we can see lines on roads too, which means that provides a communication medium through which we can directly speak to this machine. That's how I can transmit messages kind of directly to it. Um, it's a space in which we share an awareness of the world. And so I think I've kept, and maybe this will come up in a bit, this interest in where are our shared spaces of communication with this non-human intelligence. And the second departure point for this is the slow but kind of again growing and perhaps obvious realization that what we tend to call AI in the present moment, um, uh, which is, you know, applied statistics at high speed, very, very fast, powerful computers doing stuff, but very impressively, is a very particular idea of intelligence, right? I feel this, I felt this, you know, way back with, you know, the huge focus on the big technology companies on things like beating people at games, right? That's a part of their thinking that seems to infect almost everything they do. It was obvious when they were just building computers to beat humans at chess or Go. It's still very much present when they're building, um, you know, large language models to put people out of work. I mean, that's the main thing they say about them. And we should always take the pronouncements of the tech companies with very large grains of salt. But like, they're pretty much avowed intent is to take people's jobs, right? It's this view that whatever they're building will kind of surpass humanity in some way. It will be this better than human performance that is designed to make some people obsolete within certain domains of life, like the workforce. Um, and that deep characteristic of all of the large scale corporate AI being built in the present moment made me think that what we're building is this thing, what they are building, I should say, is this thing that I call corporate intelligence, right? It's the kind of intelligence that's imagined by corporations. So um, it's this very, very narrow idea of what makes something intelligent, which is largely whatever makes you profits, and whatever kind of suborns or supersedes all your competitors in whatever form they are. And the competitor for AI is like human brains. Um, so that's, you know, that's what they're trying to beat. But that is their intention, to beat it. That's what they think being intelligent is to win. Which is such a, you know, terrifyingly narrow perspective. But it really it's also kind of understandable, because our general idea of intelligence is so narrow and always has been. Um, that when humans talk about intelligence, they mean we mean what humans do. Um, we mean the collection of kind of cognitive abilities that we regard largely as being uniquely human. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you can pull on here, from you know, the ability to remember, to make plans, to kind of visualize complex things, to use tools, to use language. Um, like, it's this whole massive grab bag that people basically pick which things they think are important depending on the context, which is fine. But the unspoken assumption is always that humans are the best at these things. Um, and it's, you know, there is something unique and special about human intelligence. And so, of course, when we set out to make artificial intelligence, we basically, the human is the model. The human is the model, and also because it's corporate intelligence, human is the thing to beat. Um, which is a shame, because there's so much more to the possibilities of intelligence than that. You know, I've been really struck in the last few years that there's something so extraordinary about being in this moment in which, as a at least with the Western dominant science culture, there's this deep obsession with artificial intelligence, whatever the hell it is, which we're very bad at discussing. But we're clearly completely obsessed with it. It's in all the media. It's garners huge amounts of investment. All of this. Just at the time, we're in a vast ecological crisis, in which the rest of the world demands our attention and is like actively trying to communicate with us in ways documented by scientists, in all kinds of ways, in the behavioral sciences and so much more. The last few decades have shown this extraordinary flowering of kind of intelligence behavioral research that I'll speak about in a moment. Um, and at the same time, some of us are starting to pay slightly more attention to non-Western cosmologies that have always insisted upon the intelligence and agency of non-humans, and recognizing how denuded of relationships, of recognition of non-human agency, the dominant science has been for the last few centuries. So what do I mean when I talk about this, like, broadening of an idea of intelligence? As I say, you know, one of the main characteristics of being human is our incredible failure to recognize the intelligence of other creatures, because we've always modeled our idea of intelligence around what we do, right? And the way we tended historically to talk about the intelligence of non-humans was to say, well, what can you do that is like a little bit like what we do? And like, okay, you're not as good at it, but like pick a couple of abilities and like maybe we'll kind of let you into this special club that humans obviously belong to, and maybe a few of you can kind of come vaguely close if you do your little tricks right. Um, and because of the way we've structured that worldview and all the experiments we've based it on, we have this very strange idea of what constitutes intelligence and who's capable of enacting it. Um, as an example of how we structure those experiments, my favorite example of this is always the gibbon. Um, because for a long time, gibbons refused to participate in these experiments in a way that really frustrated scientists. They do all these tests on various animals, particularly on like our close relations, the higher primates. Um, uh, and they would perform all these tests, and the gibbons just refused. They wouldn't pick stuff up. They just looked bored. Um, you know, One of the classic tests was that they would of tool use would be to place some sticks within the animal's enclosure and put some food just outside it. And if the animal was smart, then of course it would use the stick and get the thing and eat it. And gibbons just showed no interest at all, until at one point, in the to come 20 years into this research, someone redesigned the experiment to hang the sticks from the top of the enclosure. At which point the gibbons immediately went, "Oh no!" Grab the stick, and in that moment they like became intelligent according to our human reading of the situation. Of course, they've been smart all along, but gibbons are brachiators. They live swinging about in the trees. Most of the time, their embodiment of their intelligence is oriented differently to us. So that's the kind of first point of this differentiation of intelligences, is that intelligence is not just something that happens in the brain, in the head, in a vacuum. It's something that's embodied. And it's also something that's relational, right? So it takes place throughout the entire body and depends on the relationship that your body has with the world. And it also depends on like the environment itself and how you relate to it, because intelligence is something that manifests in encounters with other beings, bodies, and contexts. It's not something that can ever occur just in a vacuum, um, which is not in itself a critique of AI, in the sense that like AI is not happening in a vacuum. It's full of context. It has many of these systems have senses, they have data, they have knowledge, they have memory. They can gather and do all kinds of new things. That's quite clear. But it means that it may be oriented differently. That the kinds of AI we're making may not be like human intelligence, and there's something kind of quite fundamentally interesting in that. That there are in fact many different ways of doing intelligence. In fact, of course, there's infinite ways, potentially. Um, the octopus has become a bit of the sort of charismatic megafauna of kind of chats about intelligence. I'm sure many of you have seen the Netflix film, which I haven't, or read one of the many books about how brilliant these creatures are. But they are really brilliant. Um, uh, they have some extraordinary set of skills. They're incredibly good at problem solving. They're very good at escaping when we try to capture them. Good for them. But they can do some quite particular things like recognize individual humans. We can't recognize individual octopuses, so they're like better at us than that. And do a whole range of amazing things. But one of the interesting things to think about is where that intelligence comes from and how it comes about, because it's kind of hard to think of a creature that is so radically different to us embodiment wise in terms of its experience and environment than the octopus. And yet we share like some quite interesting similarities. We have this very similar eye, this kind of round gel globe, um, that that has evolved separately from ours. It's a thing called convergent evolution. So their eye is similar but different, because our last known ancestor was some kind of blind flatworm living on the bottom of the ocean floor about 400 million years ago. So it's not the same eye. These two different lines of evolution both evolved eyes separately. And what's interesting about that is if you can evolve something as complex and interesting as the eye separately, but in a similar fashion, but different, then why not intelligence and every other behavior that we have? What the octopus tells us is that intelligence is not the result of one long line of progress towards us. Um, so much of our thinking is based on these various versions of the idea of the kind of the tree of life, the great scale, the scala natura, as they called it in the 19th century. This kind of pillar or rising curve of some description where all the little weird stuff down here getting bigger, getting its thumbs, getting its lungs, until you get us at the top with our big brains. Um, that's not true. That's not how things work. In the words of the brilliant evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis, everything is equally evolved. Everything on this planet has been evolving for the same length of time in all of its weird and complicated, mushy ways into its various niches and contexts, having all of these different experiences. And almost any of the things that we think make us unique, if they are unique, they're the result of our own particular niche. But it's highly likely that they just exist in other forms, in different contexts, in all kinds of ways. And this thing that we think of as the tree or pillar of life with us at the top is really a kind of net or a cloud in which intelligence, rather than being the unique product at the top, is something that has actually flowered everywhere in all of these different forms and can come in as many different flavors as there are forms of embodiment and context on this planet, which, as I say, are kind of potentially infinite. And we can't really know in what forms those things will manifest, in terms of what kind of strata, what flesh or not they will run upon. And they may also in many ways be fundamentally unknowable to us. There's a really brilliant experiment from a few years ago done by some scientists in Bristol where they placed caterpillars on the leaves of cabbage plants, and they recorded with very good microphones the sounds of the caterpillars munching on the leaves, and they measured the levels of like anti-caterpillar chemicals that leaves released when they were being munched on. And then they took the caterpillars away. And then a little while back, they put the caterpillars on again, and the caterpillars, sorry, they didn't put the caterpillars on again. They played the sound of the caterpillars back to the plants. No caterpillars present at all. And the plants still released the same chemicals. And they didn't do this when presented with other sound cues. They recognized the particular sound of the caterpillars. So plants can hear. And we have no idea how they do this. We have no idea what sound means to them, right? Like how, not just how it's perceived, but like how it's enacted as it passes through them. Like what is it for the plant to receive sound in some way? And yet from this, we can say quite explicitly that we share a world, right? We share a sensory world in which both humans and plants participate. Like when I talked about the self-driving car earlier as both being able to see the lines on the road, well, both us and the plants can hear the sound of the caterpillars munching. Like we share a sensory experience of the world. Even though the mechanism for that sharing of the world is unknown to us. Science will probably uncover at some point, like how plants hear. It's probably not that hard to do. But they do other stuff. Plants remember and learn from experience. I'm not going to tell you about all of those experiments, but they're in the book and they're also easy to find, and they're really, really fascinating. And they go much deeper than just the ability to hear into things like memory, learning, planning. Plants make quite complex plans and change their plans of the routes that they'll grow based on external stimuli. They communicate. They do. In short, all of the things that when animals do it, we call intelligent. And yet, as I say, we don't know how they do it, and in many cases that will probably remain unknowable. But yet they are multiple forms of intelligence at play in the world. So intelligence is embodied, it's relational, it's multiple, perhaps infinitely so, in all these different forms, and it can manifest on in very different bodies, and under very different situations in all kinds of ways. and we can see some of this kind of uh, extraordinariness happening, not just in ways we don't understand. We can like compare it even at the greatest extremes to some of the things that we can do, if that's still a useful and interesting thing to do. You know, another great kind of yeah charismatic megafauna of the intelligence world is the what known as slime molds. If you've ever gone walking in a kind of damp forest, you might have seen these weird patches of kind of furry colors on the ground. They look a bit like lichen or algae or fungi, but they're not really any of those things, and they don't belong in any of those categories. They don't sit easily within our classification systems, in part because they behave very oddly. They spend a lot of their living time as kind of free floating nuclei in big sacs of cytoplasm, and yet then at sometimes when threatened or under duress, they will uh, come together into kind of fruiting bodies like fungi. And some of them will basically commit suicide so that the collective itself will survive. So they trouble our species categories, the definite distinctions between individuals and collectives. Funny little slimy creatures have this amazing property where they're very good at finding the most efficient routes between different places. This is something we've noticed. So if there's food sources here, here, and here, and here. Now, this is something we can understand, right? Because we're really interested in doing this as well. There's a very old mathematical problem formulated by Euler back in like 17th century called the Bridges of Königsberg problem, where he asked how would you get from one side of the city of Königsberg, which had 7 bridges, to the other side, only crossing each bridge once, and could you figure it out in a reasonably short time? And the answer is you can't figure out in a reasonably short time. There's no shortcuts. To figure it out, you have to figure out every different route. There's 7 bridges, so that's 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 different routes. This is today better known as the traveling salesman problem. Just imagine you have to visit 7 cities, each one. Imagine you're UPS or FedEx or a bunch of other complex things. There's lots of different ways to approach this problem, but it's a really hard problem because we have no shortcut for it. And as you add more cities, bridges, whatever, it just gets harder. So if you add one more, it's 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 1. Right, this is what's called an exponential problem. The graph of solving it goes like this. And this is the kind of problem that humans and computers absolutely hate. Slime molds don't. They solve this problem in linear time, which means the graph looks like this. They don't take more time as the problem gets harder. They take a little bit more time, but not in this way that becomes unsolvable quite quickly. And we have no idea again how they do it, like the plants. But just to be really clear about that, this tiny, strange microorganism can solve with nothing but oat flakes on a petri dish a problem that not only humans find to be impossible, but that is unsolvable at scale by the fastest supercomputers we've ever built. So there's just this kind of radically different thinking happening here that once again we don't understand in any kind of way that we can describe in the ways that we're used to describing the world through a kind of scientific lens of understanding. We can model it, we can see it happening, but it seems to belong to a category of things that are kind of fundamentally unknowable to us because we are limited in what we can know because of the anthropocentric limits of our own intelligence, because we are ourselves limited to the embodied relational intelligence that we have developed. So we live in a world of like quite radical unknowns, yet full of these extraordinary abilities. And the final form of intelligence I'd like to mention that's like becomes very apparent when you start to look beyond the human, although humans probably do this too, but I mean, is collective intelligence. Um, uh, what we've learned in the last couple of decades is that uh, many species, particularly plants, are very, very, very good at communicating and at sharing. Beneath the forest floors, beneath a huge part of the Earth's surface, are what are now known to be these what are called mycelial networks, mycorrhizal fungal threads that grow not just around, but actually into the roots of plants, into the cells that make up those roots. These things are fused at the most basic molecular level. And these threads that run between, for example, trees in the forest, allow those trees to share nutrients. They do this preferentially with their kin. Trees know their kin. They know the trees they're related to, and they choose to share with them more, but they will share with other trees, and they will even share across species. So when, the broadleaf trees in summer are getting all the light, they send some of the nutrients that they're generating to the coniferous trees, the needle trees. And then in winter, when the broadleaf trees, deciduous trees drop their leaves, the flow changes direction. And so the forest balances out the foods that it has, not equally, but in kind of through various exchange mechanisms for everyone. These networks are also used for communication. The trees are talking to each other. When one tree is attacked by insects or something, it will send messages through this network to acknowledge, to warn others. This is a collective intelligence at work. The ecological world is one of intelligences in communication and in relation to each other across species, right? Which is not, that's the bit that we in particular lacking. There's one other lesson though that I think is really interesting of these forest networks that I find, that I keep thinking about, and I haven't. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. I don't know if I'm right about this, or at least it's just a speculation, but I think it's a very interesting one. When the first kind of researchers in the 1990s, I think it's around 97, had really started to put all this stuff about forest networks together. There was a special issue of the journal Nature that was released, that focused on all of this research. And the title of that edition was The Wood Wide Web, right? Which is just great. And the editors chose that title very carefully because they understood that it would communicate something quite fundamental to their audience, about what they were talking about, because their audience were becoming familiar with the World Wide Web. This is the late 90s. A lot of people have heard of it by now. And in particular, they now understand what a network of connected intelligences might sort of look like, because they've heard about the internet and all these computers talking about each other. Now, the World Wide Web and the World Wide Web are very not the same thing. They operate structurally and procedurally very differently. But that mental model of a connected network of things is very interesting. Not least because, of course, the researchers who first worked on the World Wide Web were some of the first people to be connected to the nascent internet back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, before most of us got it, because they worked for large research institutions, which were the first places to get these networks, and therefore were some of the first people to be actively involved in networks at scale, to generate these mental models of networks that they then saw out in the world. And it's a two-way process as well, because in the early noughties, when the internet had reached kind of this really massive scale, that it was starting to challenge a lot of our ideas about networks. Researchers discovered essentially that our standard kind of mathematics of topology didn't apply to the internet. This is a map of the internet, by the way. Apparently, this thing that we'd built, we didn't again really understand how it worked, because you had all these different nodes. Some of them had more connections than others. That didn't seem to matter. You could take out nodes and stuff would route around it. It was like a very complex, interesting network. They basically had to just build a new type of mathematics to describe this network. It's called network theory, around scale, what then became called scale-free networks. Really interesting stuff, which it then turned out applied to ecology. It provided a new groundwork for looking at both the forest networks, but a whole bunch of other relationships within ecological networks that, again, we didn't have the language to speak about, and therefore to see or recognize until we developed this this way of talking about this thing that we'd built, the internet. And I think there's something so fascinating to me about this, that I don't know whether it's a solipsism on our part, if it's just like a weakness of the mind, or if it's something more like obtuse, but that we seem to need to build these little toys of the world, in before we recognize the world itself. And I suspect that perhaps that's what we're doing with AI. That this moment that we're in, this obsession with AI, is a way of kind of introducing us to something else, because as humans, at least as humans stuck within the enculturation of Western scientific discourse, we've become blind to all the intelligences around us. We think of human intelligence as this pinnacle and peak. And one of the things that AI is perhaps teaching us in interesting ways is that human intelligence is not the only way of doing intelligence. There's multiple. There's at least one other kind of intelligence out there that's AI, and if more than one, then potentially infinite. And so perhaps like the internet before it, and perhaps other things, this thing that we're building is to remind ourselves that the things that we make, as interesting and fascinating they are mere kind of shadow mirrors of the far greater and more profound structures and relationships that already exist in the world around us. Um, what do we do with that knowledge? Like, how does it change the things that we make and things we think about? And in the last maybe 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, I want to talk a bit about what might change under these realizations. First, like a big practical current thing, and then some artistic reflections. Um, in the book, in Ways of Being, my most recent book, I wrote quite a lot about like what are the political implications of thinking about a more than human intelligence and moving that forward into a more than human politics. Um, and I talk about the benefits of including like non-humans recognizing that intelligence into our um, uh, kind of coming into communion with, into relationship, into discussion with, and into political alignment with non-humans. And then I'm often asked, what's that actually look like? So here's an example of what happens when you take more than human intelligence in all its multiply differently embodied forms, many of which are unknowable to us, take them seriously and actually try and do something with them. Um, this is the International Space Station, which is still like one of the coolest things humans have done. Complicated in various ways, but a pretty great achievement. And on the side of the International Space Station are like a bunch of antennae that get put there by various scientific institutes and people who sponsor them to receive particular signals and be able to do particular things. And one of them, which was put up there a few years ago by a consortium led by Max Planck Research Institutes in Germany, um, was a specialized antenna for picking up signals from animal tags, from uh, sensors of various kinds that were being basically put on animals. The advantage of putting this thing on the ISS is that it meant they could use much lower powered signals on ground, which they could make these tags much smaller, means they could gather more information at a larger scale, became cheaper, etc., etc. And one of the places they put all of those tags, a bunch of these new tags, was onto loads of sheep and goats and dogs and various other animals in two locations in Italy, in a village called L'Aquila in central Italy, and another place and on the slopes of Mount Etna in Sicily, two highly volcanically active areas, seismically active areas as a result. And what they found was that they just put the tags were just accelerometers. They just monitored like how much the animals moved around. And what they found was that the in the days and hours leading up to the earthquakes, animal behavior changed in ways that were actually visible to these sensors. Um, to the extent that they could actually build earthquake early warning alarms based on this data that were better than any of the other um, uh, current systems for earthquake warnings that we have. So a thing that will actually save lives potentially and prevent damage and do all these kind of things that are good. And this is incredibly fascinating for various reasons. Not least because we have no idea how they do it, right? Uh, there's long been stories in kind of folklore and mythology of like animals behaving weirdly before earthquakes, but we've never been able to use that at a scale that makes it something that might save lives, provide this kind of warning. And we also still have no idea how they do it. There's a bunch of like scientific theories, none of which have been proven or seem to really make sense of how animals might sense seismic activity in advance in ways that our seismographs and anything else we use can't detect. Like we just have to ask them, and we have to trust them when they tell us what they know, without assuming that we can know it in this kind of the dominant way in which Western science likes to know things, which is usually by cutting them up into small pieces until they're dead. This requires living animals, and it requires good relations with those animals in order to know these things. The same thing that's super interesting is also that humans, international space stations, and goats weren't the only part of this loop. Um, you can't just look at the data and like extract meaning from it. Humans aren't that good at look at complex data. AI is very good at that, or machine learning at least. And actually, to make a meaningful like alarm system out of the goat data, the scientists had to use machine learning algorithms originally developed for high frequency trading, like the absolute worst use of AI around kind of private, making vast amounts of private money from um, leveraging complex financial transactions, which I kind of like to think of as kind of bankers, penitents retiring back to the country to kind of work on the land and be part of this kind of regenerative system. And so, what you have here is AI that is not seeking to dominate or to win. What it's seeking to do is to facilitate communication between a host of different bodies, between humans, non-humans itself, technological systems, that we may all survive and thrive together. And you can generalize from that potentially to all kinds of other relations. I was going to talk about the crab computer. Um, uh, why is it interesting to this is kind of another, this isn't an example of intelligence, this is an example of flipping it around. I want to do this briefly so it will explain my final point. Computation, I've talked a little bit about how intelligence does not need to be run on the same substrates, right? Not everything runs, intelligence doesn't always run on what we recognize as a pink squishy brain. And at the same time, you can talk about how the fact that computation is not something that only runs on computers. In fact, you can do computation with pretty much anything, including crabs. Um, this comes from some wonderful research in Japan, where they looked at the swarming behavior of blue soldier crabs. These crabs move in huge kind of groups, sometimes up to thousands of creatures across lagoons together. They move collectively in very predictable ways. And so the researchers built crab computers out of them. They took the form of the logic gate, which is what there are billions of within every single computer chip. They're essentially a kind of switch that change the output depend on the input. This is how you do calculation on computers today. But instead of using electrons, they used crabs to perform exactly the same function, in which the crabs are released into these kind of gates, and the different crabs that enter the different inputs produce different outputs. You can build a computer out of literally anything. Um, People have built computers out of water for years, for example. There's a whole field of hydrological computing. This is my favorite example. This is a computational model and simulator of the British economy that they built a few of in the 1950s, first built at the London School of Economics by Bill Phillips. There's a tank of water at the bottom, pumps at the top, the water kind of comes down, and there's all these little levers and taps that allow you to change the flow, various kind of taxes or imports, exports, to model a simulated economy and to see what the results would be. This turned out to be more accurate than most of the computer simulations at the time, so accurate, in fact, that they built several more for government departments, and these things actually ran in government departments, actually designing and running the British economy for a couple of decades. And that's super interesting. Again, a couple of reasons. This fact that you're running this on a very different substrate. There's something significant to me about the fact this is not a binary computer. This is an analog computer. It runs on like the liquidity on the flow of the actual world, rather than a world that has been reduced to discrete ones and zeros, to these kind of data points that obscure quite a lot. Analog computers capture more. And in the case of this, they're also more visible, right? They allow us to see a process in action in a way that digital computer doesn't. It's not all locked away behind a screen. It's not all hidden away in a little chip. You are at the controls of this thing. You're seeing the changes you're making, and you see the results of those things. And as a result, this is a legible system. You can see it in operation. That matters as well, particularly in an era where we're building these like incredibly complicated AI systems, where we cannot look inside them and they're completely unknowable to us. I did speak about unknowability as a good thing, and I think it can be, but it's a risk when it is given, when it is put in charge of things. rather than being part of a kind of collective enterprise in which we're all involved. Um, so I wanted to end this with an example of where I'm going with this as an artist. That's based on these ideas of both these different forms of intelligence and of this idea of kind of redesigning the systems both of computation and thinking that we use. Um, I thought quite hard about essentially what an artwork based on what I write about in ways of being um, might look like, that takes into account these multiple forms of intelligence, but also the forms of um, politics that it involves, right? And I was like, okay, so what would it take to build like a truly biological computer? Let's start, for example, with the the von Neumann kind of model that we see here. This is the basic model of most digital computers today. Like, well, if you look at the functions of all the computers we use today, like we can pretty much replace them with non-human intelligences, actions of various kinds. Um, and you could put the slime molds into some of these kind of decision making calculating processes in the middle. We have a number of ways of communicating with plants through chemical systems, through pathways, through light, apparently through sound, that produce chemical changes in those plants, signaling changes that would be input output systems. We know that the information is both remembered but also encoded into the biological structure of various plants. Could we use plants and trees as a kind of input output system, so as a memory system to like store this information, be retrieved, and how would that information be communicated back to us? Again, what are the sensory worlds we share with these creatures that if we paid attention to, we would see the results of these kind of discussions and deliberations happening. um, and also crucially, I've come to realize by thinking about this, like, how do we come together um, under mutually agreeable principles in which um, the beings that make up such a system are not just like mechanical components of a system, but are partners participating in this with equality, in good relationship to another. What is the political system of this? And I realized throughout this project, called Server Farm, that this is kind of it's multiple things at once. It's what are the different beings that come together to make a collective computational system, a system essentially of which you can ask questions and get answers back. But what is the political system of governance? What is the arrangement that we're in? That we are all in this together. What does that look like? Also, of course, what questions are we asking, and how do we read the responses? Um, what does it look like? I kind of, I look to art to imagine that, because you certainly can't look to the history of computation. This is Charles Jenks's Garden of Cosmic Speculation in Scotland, a really extraordinary place in which he encodes various kind of mathematical ideas, theories, and even computations into the landscape itself. Um, these you can make landscape computers in just the same way. I think of works like Agnes Dean's Wheatfield, um, ecological work that insists that the work of artists is also to grow genuine alternatives to dominant systems rather than just representing them. That we can actually do regenerative work ourselves. And I think of like radical experiments in more than human environments, like Ant Farm's Dolphin Embassy, a project from the 1970s, mostly unrealized. It certainly never got to look like this, where the artists of Ant Farm, radical sort of San Francisco collective, paddle out into San Francisco Bay and try and talk to the dolphins. Um, like for me, these are the places, after all that scientific and um, discussion of what other intelligences actually look like. This is like where um, uh, the role of AI and art, right, is how we critically address this thing, talk about it, and think about it in ways and push it into quite radically different directions that are not subservient to the types of corporate intelligence that were discussed at the beginning. What it looks like, maybe it just looks like gardening. Maybe it looks like permaculture farming. Maybe that's a good answer to the question. But for a long time, I've had the fundamental understanding that, like, for a lot of us, and particularly for the large-scale capitalist systems that run the world, like computation is how we think. It's the dominant metaphor for the world around us. And AI is a supercharged form of that computation. It's narrowed our idea of thinking into an incredibly tiny domain of what is possible to think. Therefore, to reimagine computation is to reimagine the way that we think and to reimagine the possibilities of the world itself. Right? So artistic engagement at every level with technologies of all kinds is ultimately about reimagining them in incredibly radical ways. The current conversations and debates around AI are, seen from a distance, not in disagreement. Whether you have the doomer people who think the kind of AI is going to take over the world and destroy us all, or whether people who think it's the most profitable thing in the world, or frankly, the people who think they can use it to make as is to make kind of artworks that are more interesting or change audience for art, they all look pretty close to me because they're not reimagining this thing that's being described to us in any particular way. That there is a position somewhere else over here in which we reimagine not just the technologies we use, but our fundamental tenets of what intelligence itself is and who we can relate to in order to make entirely new worlds around us. That for me is the kind of exciting place to go from this, from which AI is really just the very starting point of a much larger conversation. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, James, for that fabulous presentation. Really rich. And I can see in the chat everyone bringing their own knowledge and reading to bear and suggesting books that they've read that have made them think differently around questions of intelligence. So thank you so much, James. Now, the Q&A section is live. We already have 2 anonymous questions that we'll go to in a minute, but if anyone would like to add to them, please feel free to jump in. So I'll get stuck into them. Our first question from anonymous participant 1 says, on the basis that we have this ecological crisis, as you noted, should we even be pursuing AI? Can you see it has benefits that will help us deal with some of these bigger existential threats?
I don't think I'm enough of a doomer to say we should chuck it all over, because I don't think we should be chucking much over at the moment because we don't know what's going to help. And there are things that AI is genuinely really good at. Let's be very clear. There are domains of thinking and problems, things like drug discovery, this kind of protein folding, a bunch of science work is really, really aided by this kind of stuff. I don't know if fusion is the answer, right? I'm not that kind of scientist, but it seems to be really good at figuring that out. And that's a thing that people have been talking about for a very long time that might be useful in kind of energy, reducing CO2, blah, 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 blah. So it has a role. I think we should I think we should worry a lot about the way that both the discourse and the development of AI has been completely captured by Silicon Valley and its various forms, and that's where all the work is taking place, because that's just going to produce terrible things, as we know. But there's a long history of very good academic and elsewhere, and non-scientific and non-Western, as I think we've talked about in previous lectures, work on AI that I don't think we should be giving up on. And I'd love to see AI as well. My cosmology admits the possibility of interesting actual AI. So let's keep working on that. Always on the technologies, but just beware of who's wielding them and to what ends.
Thanks, James. We have a second question from an anonymous participant who says, it seems like humans are good at exploiting other creatures to enhance human intelligence, such as the example you showed to predict earthquakes. If this ability can be considered to be intelligence, have you found any other creatures doing similar things?
Other creatures doing similar things to the goats and the detecting earthquakes. Yeah, all kinds of ones. I mean, you can there's a lot of research in the biological the sciences that sees uh, that is starting to understand most of the species we interact with as engaged in forms of communication that we can learn from in various ways. They may be called biosensors, or whatever it is in this kind of scientific terminology. But what we're actually saying is that, like, plants and animals around us can change in response to the environment in ways that are useful to us knowing. We've harnessed some of these in brilliant ways. In uh, water plants in Poland, they use mussels. So they have species of freshwater mussels that are incredibly sensitive to impurities in the water. And if the water is not very, very clean, the mussels immediately clamp shut in microseconds, right? Faster than any technological system we've built can detect those impurities. And so what they have in these Polish water farms is they have beds of mussels that the water going out into people's taps flows through, and they have sensors attached to the mussels. And if the mussels close, they immediately shut the floodgates and cut off the water because there's some kind of impurity in the water that may be damaging to people. So we already have creatures whose awarenesses and knowledges are available to us. In the book, I wrote about hyperaccumulators, these plants that have evolved to be capable of living in mostly in very metal-rich soils that are toxic to other kinds of plants, and that store those metals in their stalks and leaves. In ways that can actually be harvested by humans. So there's work going on at the moment to use those plants to mine metals, essentially, rather than the kind of destructive extractive processes we use at the moment. And they also like clean the soil essentially by doing it. So there's work to basically plant them deliberately on old mining sites or whatever to decontaminate them. So they have all these kind of fantastic uses. You can also see that, and I do, as a form of knowledge. The plants and the researchers that I worked with in Greece, they work with a particular set of plants that have evolved in very specific places. They're endemic to particular regions. There's one from all over that grows mostly around the Mediterranean. There's one that grows only in northern Greece and Albania, and there's one Bormuella tymphea that only grows within 50 kilometers of this particular mountain. And Bormuella tymphea turns out, unsurprisingly, to be the best at cleaning that soil and extracting metal from that particular location because it has a situated knowledge and understanding of that place because it's evolution. That, for me, is kind of abilities, knowledges, and awarenesses in non-humans that we're learning from all the time and have always been learning from. The question then is how we choose to perhaps relate differently to the bearers of that knowledge, rather than just seeing it, again, as previously, as a kind of resource to be extracted, and instead as something that we actually work and live with to our mutual betterment.
Thanks, James. I have a question here from Hannah Riddler-Hawes. Hey, Hannah, are you happy to unmute and be embodied as you ask this question?
Not really, but I'll do it. Morning. Thank you, James, so much. Now I've forgotten what my question was. So yes, I was just thinking how much I really enjoyed your insistence and your call for resistance to the dominant model, which has always been artist, but it feels like such a massive task with AI and the speed that it's moving at and the weight behind it. So I just wondered if you've been able to open up any of your conversations with industry or big tech, or if you would even want to. But, my first thought there was, this is great. When are they going to talk about this?
I mean, I don't have many conversations with them. I haven't for a while, but the conversations that I've had in the past are usually terrifying, because they are ideologically driven. And this is really important to understand, that the people who are developing this believe in a model of the world that this is in service to. It's one of those situations where you should really sort of believe what they're saying when they say that they believe that this is like a world-ending, world-changing technology, and then see it, and then also watch what they're doing about that and what their response to it is, how gleeful their faces are when they talk about it. They not only do they think of AI as this kind of all-powerful thing that is a human creation, but that will sort of trump humans, they also believe in a fundamentally sort of mechanistic computational universe. They believe that, and this can sound like weird conspiracy theory stuff, but they're all on the record saying it. They basically believe that the world is governed by numbers. There's a kind of computational underpinning to the world, and therefore AI is like sort of interacting directly with God in their world model. It's bonkers, but it's what they think, and they have a lot of power to promote that view in various ways. So question that, like, they're not going to change, but of course, like, where would we expect them to? Like, it's just the latest, most exponential form of capitalism, something much deeper, and we know people are those who benefit from that are pretty stuck on it as well. What does forms of resistance look to it? Well, it involves in particularly insisting constantly on really on the narrowness of their position, you know, recognizing that what they're describing is such a kind of tiny piece of the possibility of what intelligence might be, and, you know, calling them out on this kind of absolute mad AI godhead stuff they talk about. This is just very fast computers doing statistics. It's just not that big a deal. And doing the ecological work in its place that the rest of us recognize really needs to be done. Uh, Within the industry, it could be changed by a different set of values. Though I think we can see from the open AI saga that doesn't really hold. It can be attacked from the outside it by more diverse participation in AI technologies, things like the indigenous AI movement or feminist AI and various other things, which is always the case of getting the tools into more hands, into different hands, produces very different outcomes in interesting ways. But for me, the resistance to AI as such is largely on its insistence continuing to exist, that it's not really that exciting in and of itself, that it's, you know, it's a pointer towards much larger interesting things, and it should remind us at all times that that's where our focus should really be.
Thanks for that question, Hannah. We've got an anonymous participant asking you to get involved in an opportunity. So maybe you can contact James through his website for that. So we'll then move on to Janice's question. Janice, would you like to unmute?
Yes, sorry, and thank you, James. That was so clear and so well presented, and I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts, and I'm off to buy your book. But all that to say, I work in education, and I guess I'm just interested, and excuse me because I had to answer the door for the plumber, so in case you did speak about this, where you've seen AI being used within learning environments, particularly art learning environments that might be university or collectives, or where people can play, experiment, and perhaps expand and think more positively about AI in a bigger way, and not in a corporate intelligence way.
I haven't, to be honest. I'm afraid I'm not particularly connected with like arts education, with education in general, so I don't really know. I've been involved in technology education more in the past, and as I don't know what's happening around there at the moment. I hope some of the lessons have been learned. Which means I'll put it this way: you know, when I did computing at school, a long time ago, the computing education I received at school level was largely in like how to use Microsoft Word. You know, it was there was some other stuff as well, but it was broadly teaching us to use a tool that we would need for like the jobs market later on. I've On the one hand, it's very encouraging that there's been a huge amount of educational noise in recent years around teaching to code, but I'm very aware that that has been largely with the same idea, that there's jobs in tech and therefore kids should learn whatever programming language they need to get a job, you know, in commercial coding. And the problem with that is that it doesn't change any of the kind of status quo or possibilities around this stuff. I taught myself to code really badly. I'm a terrible coder, but when you do it outside the structures of kind of commercial implications and applications, you learn to do different things, and you discover like radically different possibilities for it. It's for me, I always say everyone should learn to code, but like not for this like getting a job reason. Is because it transforms the things around you, particularly this interactive telly we're talking through, into like an actual powerful tool that you can use to shape and change things. So my hope is that like an education in AI, whatever it looks like today, is not based on like here's how you use Midjourney or let's go and play with this, but like this is how you make an AI. This is how you train one. This is how you actually create one that better reflects your environment, your values, your interests, and out of which you learn actually what makes up intelligences in ways that you can work with or critique or both, in all the practical ways that like education or progressive education is supposed to instill. Like I fundamentally believe there's a kind of like the point of education is really to teach that kind of critical thinking and ability to explore. And if anything that just says like you should learn about AI is like, well, you should learn about all kinds of things, and those things will give you the critical application to talk about AI perhaps at some future point. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janice, for your question. I'm going to ask Chaitanya's question on his behalf. He is currently voiceless. Chaitanya says, thanks for your presentation, James. I'd like to hear you speak further about a fundamental conceit that we humans approach the world with, knowability. We proceed from the assumption, or perhaps fervent desire, that the world is essentially knowable. And being knowable, it is ownable. Strangely enough, is AI allowing us to confront unknowability even as we become more reflexive about our limits?
Yeah, and you've phrased it very well already. This interesting thing about knowability and certainly the sort of dominant science position on it, which has been encoded into all of our machines thus far. And if we can reconstruct it as data, then it is accessible to us, and if we can't, then it's sort of unknowable, but we deny that unknowability, and so it's basically becomes kind of hidden or suppressed, that which can't be fitted into the machines and scientific theories. And yeah, it's perhaps a hope from AI that it constitutes this kind of really interesting unknowability. But before AI, I think that's true of large technological systems. And in fact, I think it's one of the appeals of their sort of glamour that, again, without wanting to generalize too much about humans in general, like we seem to have a craving or a desire, or at least a fascination with large unknowabilities, whether they're encoded as religions or technologies. Like that we have a weakness for them and a tendency to make myths about them, and they are part of our culture. That hasn't entirely gone away. It's just kind of switched focuses into various things. AI definitely seems to be a kind of big embodiment of it at present, of this kind of like touching the bad tooth, like touching that unknowability that makes us nervous and unsettled in certain ways. The thing is that the only caveat to all of that is that that unknowability can be wielded very powerfully by those who kind of control those technologies, who have a kind of single-minded view of their application. There's this brilliant interview or article about Google Translate from a few years ago, where when they first started using like large-scale machine learning to really make their translation systems really good, where there's this reporter like following one of the Google engineers around, going like, but what's it doing inside? Like, how does it work? Explain it. And it's like and the Google engineer eventually turns around at some point and just goes like, I am not in the habit of trying to visualize multidimensional space, right? Which is a technical description of why it is unknowable to humans in this way. Another way of putting it is that it just thinks so differently to us. that we cannot know exactly how it is thinking. But the people who work on it, that aspect of it doesn't bother them. And in fact, in current AI research, it looks like behavioral science when you read the papers. It's kind of amazing. I was reading a paper this morning that was all about like vulnerabilities in ChatGPT, and this particular vulnerability was that if you ask ChatGPT to just say the word poem over and over again, poem, 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 it would eventually start spitting out its training data. And it's like we're at this point where we've acknowledged it's so weird and unknowable that we're just poking it like an animal in a cage. But we're doing that from the outside, right? There's also those who have actual powerful control over it. And so I don't know, maybe it's useful to think of AI. I've wandered a bit off the unknowability topic, I know, but of a system that is very related to our relations, not just to non-humans, but to many other types of humans throughout history, where we are confronting something that we don't fully understand, and that we are seeking to dominate it and to use that domination for various forms of political and financial power. That it is a thing that's part of an ecosystem. And that's maybe not a bad way to think about it, because as humans, despite our like rational scientific desires, we live as animals within a large system that is largely unknowable to us, just called the world, right? And actually, we're quite practiced about that, and we can work better with it if we're a little more comfortable in acknowledging it of that unknowability, rather than seeking to assert domination over it.
Thanks, James. Now, Andrew, you've got your question lined up. Would you like to unmute and ask James?
Hello, James. I very much look forward to reading your book, which I haven't come across yet, with its kind of reference maybe back to John Berger's Ways of Seeing somewhere in there. I've read quite a lot around the idea of, and I think possibly everybody in this meeting, would have a more complex view of intelligence than the one which constitutes the the kind of popular reaction to machines take over humans. But I just wonder, this was the cynical part of my question. I wonder whether the US industrial military complex would happily communicate with trees and octopuses if they could enlist it in their mode of domination. So I'm left wondering how your relational and embodied species view of intelligence becomes specifically anti-capitalist.
I mean, the one of the strange things about the US Army and things about that is they're immensely practical. For example, the US Army is one of the few US government organizations, who's never denied climate change, and is very clear on what's happening, and has a very clear-eyed view of things like that. They've also done huge numbers of animal experiments over time. Armies have always worked with non-humans, horses, mules, and so on and so forth. The US Army has trained dolphins, recognizing their specific intelligence, and all that kind of stuff. So it's not a science fiction proposition. How it becomes specifically anti-capitalist is that it's done outside those systems, which is the only kind of resistance to that I know of. That these the relations we have when learning from having relations with non-humans are structured around mutual exchange, mutually beneficial situations, rather than the forms of domination of one over the other. There are also like huge examples of contemporary models of, if not the non-capitalist technological production. The entirety of the open source movement, while it occurs under capitalism and in engagement with capitalist systems, is fundamentally based on the idea of removing software from the kind of property relationship that characterizes capitalist systems. There are attempts to do this within all forms of technology, and there's no reason that those can't be the underpinning of different forms of AI. Just as we already have non-capitalist relationships with all kinds of other beings. So yeah, coming to that point, I'm not sure it tracks, actually. I'm not sure that it's like, because they do it in a capitalist way, like has any particular implications for how we might do it in other ways. It, we choose the manner of the relationships that we have, and yeah, I think look at it's really interesting to read some of the work on the World Wide Web as an example of this stuff, because there are some people who write about it as this like beautiful, free, like ecological mode of exchange, and there are other people who write about it in terms of trading, like who apply very specifically like financialized analyses to it. And you can see this in ecological work as well, in terms of things like ecological services, which are one of the major ways in which the like value of non-humans are now being processed and datafied in the service of ecology and of ecological goals of sustainability and so much and so forth. But they're a mode of like taking ecological relationships and like explaining them and like numerical money term forms, so that they can be fitted into calculations that sustain the current system. So I guess a specifically anti-capitalist like ecological relationship, which I too am very much interested in, would involve beginning those relationships on principles that are simply not aligned with proving that kind of value as a future goal, not instituting forms of property relationship and not using abstract value as the measure of the value of those relationships, which I think is how most of us have relationships already. So we're off to a good start.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, James. I might be ask if I can just add a question of myself in there, because I am not allowed to add something to the Q&A under the Zoom system, and we're about to move into another tranche of questions that move us away to another area. But I was really struck, James, how you ended your talk by saying arguing for the need to grow genuine alternatives and not just represent them. Thinking back to the position of the artist, right? And I'm, thinking through like the last 15 years now, how long has it been? And thinking through, hearing you speak about your work and moving from this kind of position of the task of the artist is to make the invisible visible, right? To represent things, right? So now you're saying now we need to not just do that, we need to imagine and push into different alternatives and reimagine computation, you say. So then I wanted to ask, my question was, how would an art institution need to change to support this vision of reimagining computation rather than just representing the black boxes and making them somehow intelligent to a public?
Yeah, so as you've noticed, I mean, my thinking about my own work has got on, changes all the time. But one of the major changes in my work, at least intentionally, don't claim to always succeed at this by any means, is to move from a position of representation to one of, I guess, regeneration, which is actually not a word I've used in this context specifically before, but actually maybe that's a nice way of thinking about it. Something that's actively engaged with the thing that it's commenting upon. Because I mean, so much of the work, particularly this work that many of us characterized over the year as making the invisible visible, like it's trying to produce some kind of change in the viewer, right? An understanding that would lead to something, right? Otherwise it's not interesting. And yet I've continually found the failure of that mode in various ways. A big part of my work for many years is working on surveillance, trying to understand systems of surveillance, making them visible, communicating the fact to them, asking what was interesting about them in various ways. And I got very disillusioned about that work because I essentially felt that the main modes that artists who work with surveillance, including myself, were using was to essentially do surveillance on the audience, right? And reproduce the mechanisms of it, and then kind of desensitize their audiences to it, which I wasn't there for the other lecture, but it sounds like maybe that argument was being made about AI in another of the lectures. I'm not sure. But that, you know, that so much of the representation we do, yeah, doesn't actually, it just depicts the thing, and that's not really good enough in times of crises, frankly. It's fine, there's many art worlds, but like, if you're actually trying to do something, what are you trying to do? And if you're trying to produce some kind of change, then it seems to me that that representation alone is insufficient. And particularly in response to the ecological crisis, representation is insufficient. Making artworks about ecology is insufficient. Because we're enmeshed, for starters, because we're enmeshed in the system of ecology. If you take ecology seriously, you understand it's something that we're in, so that we can't stand outside and observe it, right? And secondly, because we know from 50 years of science communication that just telling people about stuff doesn't produce any change. Like, you have to actively produce the change, not just tell people about the change and hope they'll do something. And the result of that is moving in my own work from what practices like making the invisible invisible to something that I mostly call making work that works. And actually, I skipped over the slide. I'm wondering if I can I just do that again and put this up. Just a quick example. My work looks a lot more like things like this these days. This is a very, very like almost proof of concept idea of the work that does work, in that this is a work of engraved solar panels. So I've one of the most powerful things I've learned to do in recent years is learn things like how to wire up solar panels, not because I think solar panels will save us, but because it's like active ecological work that allows me to understand better the mechanisms at work, just as learning to code did. Like, I want to know how these systems work so that I can engage with them and see their limitations and change them and so on and so forth. In this series of work, I'm engraving solar panels with imagery of various kinds, which kind of transforms them into artworks, but they're still working, right? Here they are exhibited in an outdoor exhibition, but they were plugged in, they were powering the other artworks that were part of the exhibition. That's also happened, they've been kind of plugged in museums and elsewhere. So they're actually, the artwork itself is changing the energy mix of the art environment that it's taking part of, and therefore the wider environment. Like, these works are actually like doing ecological work. They're transforming the makeup of the atmosphere by their operation, right? So they're actually engaged that way. I don't claim all my work does this. It's something I kind of aspire to and hope to in various ways. The writing that I do is still obviously representational, but like, I think this matters, and I think it matters to institutions, to your question as well. And like, this work is hard to do institutionally in various ways, because it requires like actual engagement by institutions in various ways. Like, it's really hard to get institutions to do quite simple things often, like ratify their electrical codes so you can plug in the solar panel, right? Or just to install the solar panel itself, or to think about how they might do that artistically or with artists. One thing I found doing ecological work is that it's really hard to keep plants alive inside institutions, inside buildings, right? Because they're all enclosed buildings. And now I sit in art galleries being like, where is the world? We've spent the last 100 years or so building art institutions that are essentially hermetically sealed spaces from the world that we need to be involved with. It's obvious, but it's really key. um, and also the timeframes at which institutions work are very non-conducive to ecological work. When you have like month-long exhibition schedules, or you have 6 months to repair something, or you have a residency that lasts 2 months. Well, it takes a year to grow a plant. It takes 2 years to like start a proper field going. It takes 100 years to grow a forest. We have to rethink the scales of which these things are operating. But finally, I think all of that, most importantly, it requires these institutions to actually take sides and take risks in this kind of stuff. And taking sides is not the same as taking risks. Like, that's a step beyond. to actually be like politically committed to making this change, and therefore to make those changes in themselves. I know friends who work in the museum sector in Germany. Well, let's actually start with like institutions in Poland, which have opened themselves up as neutral spaces for LGBT people under the most recent government. They've said, like, we have space that you are being drummed out of other places, you can come and use. They've taken a lot of like political flack from that. That's what taking actual risks in the service of your beliefs looks like. It's easier to do in more liberal places. You can see when it really matters in other places. What does that look like to do that similar thing kind of ecologically? One of the things it does is it's redistributing power. So I'm really interested in, there's a movement in Germany, I think a few other places in Europe at the moment, of building citizens' assemblies, kind of direct democracy movements, adjacent stuff, which I write about a bit in the book, towards museum governance. What's it look like to bring a wider part of the public into, and a really much wider, not just the usual types, etc. A citizens' assembly means selecting at random from the whole population into museum decision making and government. Like, how do we democratize the institutions if we're really meaningful? All those are ecological work. So there's a bunch to get on with.
Thanks, James. We have another 4 minutes and another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions in the Q&A.
We can run a few minutes over if you want.
Yeah, okay. You're happy to stay for a few minutes over. Okay. Yeah. Perhaps I wonder if there's any we can combine. But it's looking quite complicated, each question itself. Simon, are you still here? Did you want to ask very, very quickly, James, the question that you have?
Yeah, if we could keep the questions short, I'll try and keep the answers short.
James, Simon's not here? He says no.
He'd prefer you to read it out.
Okay, so in Ways of Being, you discuss the idea that the metaphor is flawed, the world is not like a computer, and the computer is like the world. Please, can you discuss the differences that emerge in this reordering and share some of the significance of the claim?
I mean, briefly, what's happened in the last almost 100 years now, certainly 80 years since we developed computers, we've shaped the world in the form of the computer, in the form of the imaginary of the computer. Because computers, when they turned up, were so powerful, so game-changing, that we like we're doing with AI, we kind of assumed they were all powerful and therefore kind of all-knowing, and therefore could encapsulate everything else. And we developed this thing that I call computational thinking, which is that we came to think like computers. And therefore, everything that doesn't fit into computers, everything that's not datafied in that way, as I said before, doesn't really, either is like erased or like actively suppressed, but doesn't fit into the model of the world. The differences that arise is that you get this this ability to treat the world as a system that it can kind of be tinkered with and modeled with, even when it doesn't correspond to your senses. So I guess the thing that jumps out of me is this week, this day at the start of COP26, seeing all of the kind of statements, particularly by governments and companies, about the ways in which net zero and the plans around that would allow us to survive in whatever forms. These forms of abstraction that have been calculated versus the experience of having wildfires around you, of having floods, of having like a direct encounter with the world and what it's actually saying to us. The world, when I say that the world is not a computer, the computer is like the world, I'm saying like AI is like an interesting small model for certain types of intelligence. It's a way of partaking it. It's one lens through which to see something. but there's always multiple lenses, right? The computer and the technology it generates is one lens through which we can see and understand the world, and it's useful for doing so. But when it becomes our only lens, when it becomes our only form of interaction with the world, not only are we missing out on a huge part of the world, but like that will end badly. It will have consequences, because that which is suppressed and ignored will reassert itself, and is currently reasserting itself in like increasingly violent ways. It can't be ignored forever. So the skill that needs to be cultivated is this ability to see through kind of multiple lenses at once, to use these models if and when they're appropriate, and to use much more holistic ways of thinking most of the time.
James, I don't know if you saw, there's a question here about how you're thinking through your new aesthetic project in the current moment, given it's a decade old. And someone, an anonymous person is saying, how do you view the concept's evolution through the years, particularly in light of the technological, social, and political changes throughout the pandemic?
I mean, the new study is not something that I try to actively think about very much, I'll be honest, but like there's things that jump out at you so intensely, it's kind of like, oh, that's one of those things. I mean, it just keeps happening. Like the emergence of AI is a really a good example of it, and the way that it's been kind of textured and described and illustrated according to all of our kind of science fictional ideas about this thing. The way that AI is this sort of so much more than the little computational programs that are actually running, that it's a whole kind of imaginary of the future of the human, future of the planet. But also, I mean, critically, the most, for me, sadly, new thing about it is the kind of lack of structural understanding of what's going on, and actually the increasing difficulty of doing so. You know, the new static project started as a way of pointing at things in the world that belied a computational substrate and interconnectedness that wasn't always evident on the surface, but was sort of struggling to break through in this way. That's what I found interesting in that particular moment. That so much of the world sort of was betraying its digital origins in ways that made it possible to look, you know, through the glitch, through the network, through whichever mechanism it was, to start to sketch out these systems that had really not been well described before. I think that's probably still happening. It'd be interesting to think about the extent to which it's happening, and whether like the thing that's revealing here is not so much like AI or the structure of computation itself, but I think something much deeper, which again was always present there, right? That the structures of AI being revealed now are really much more revealing of the structures of capitalism, of the relationship between large corporations and government. Like the most new aesthetic thing to happen is undoubtedly like prime ministers of various nations pronouncing on AI and what they're going to do to stop it, or you know, that is the spectacular moment, I think. The headlines about, you know, Biden or Rishi Sunak or someone pronouncing on a science fiction concept that they clearly have very little understanding of, it gets higher headline billing than various wars, etc. Or climate change, very particularly, is I would say in this the new aesthetic moment that allows us to see the structure of power and politics that is both allowing for that, allowing for the current way of AI to be hyped to such an extent. This relationship, you know, politicians who go off and get jobs speaking for tech companies that spend vast amounts of money lobbying governments that have achieved regulatory capture in all these different ways, and the way in which that power structure hides and suppresses actual action and meaningful stuff on things like climate change, ecology, justice, and so on and so forth. That's the structure that's being revealed by the current wave. that was also always the case with the new aesthetic, though I'm not sure everyone noticed.
Great to hear your response to that and your reflections on that project. There is another question here, which is about how one begins to affect change. And it's from Keval Shah. And Keval says they're starting to get involved in food systems and changes to that. And there are lots of parallels within that system and what you discussed. During their studies, changes in food systems, there was always a debate about how change can happen, state involvement versus small grassroots organizations, and what makes the bigger impact. Of course, both are required, but how the state gets involved is crucial. Fundamentally, the capitalist system needs remodeling within the food system. How do you see the state getting involved in a way for positive change in AI and the areas you discussed?
I don't know. I can't really speak to the AI thing. It's not. I mean, I think there are people who can speak to it a lot better than me. But I mean, my answer to any question involving the state is largely to dissolve the state and replace it with something better, or at least dissolve quite large chunks of it and replace them with other forms of democracy and things like citizens' assemblies, these other new democratic tools that we're finding that I think are appear to be kind of essential for real democratic transformation that has to take place before any nominal state would act in a better way towards AI. The way to do AI better is to have more transparency around it, by which I don't mean knowing it in the ways that we discussed earlier, but I mean having a better understanding of how it's just put together, like how it functions at material level, what data's gone into it, all of that stuff, and having a more diverse array of people making it. The only way that will happen is if we have a more transparent governance culture and we have a more diverse culture in general, right? It just reflects the extreme concentration within a culture at large. So all of, like, to transform something like AI, like the transformation of the food system, is a transformation of the governance of the state itself. That's why like individual and community action really does matter, because that's like insisting that that is where the power lies and where the power actually emerges from is where it comes from. You know, you look at something like Extinction Rebellion in the UK, which, you know, one of its main calls was to call for citizens' assembly to react stuff. Or you look at the success of the citizens' assembly in Ireland in responding to climate change and changing government policy there. Then, you know, then what I know Rachel Caldicott and an organization called Careful Trouble in the UK are arguing for much this around AI governance. That, you know, whatever happens, AI governance needs to be based around. They have a very nice phrase, which is that like, AI, you know, AI should be governed for 8 billion people, not 8 billionaires. It seems fairly fundamental. But as I've mentioned, we have complete kind of regulatory and communication and funding capture by the large tech companies, which is producing the opposite thing. You know, it's a bit like my answer to the education question earlier as well. I think we should be really careful when we talk about like, why are we interested in AI again? Like, because I don't think AI is that interesting. I don't think it's that good. I don't like, it's just like, it's good at certain things, blah, 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 but it's just fast computers. Like, what do we gain from our engagement with it? Like, what skills are we learning through engaging with it that allow us to think elsewhere? Equally, what skills are you gaining from thinking about in other political areas like food systems that allow there to be work to be done elsewhere? Because for me, like, what we learn from engagement with any of these things is that people who are empowered and engaged in the systems that define their lives, in kind of whatever form, build resilience and capacity to responding to further things. And so really the thing that I'm interested in is this kind of general construction of agency and understanding skills that allow people to respond and enact in various ways, which is basically what I said at the beginning, just from the other direction. That's what required is skills, transparency, and a diversity of people engaged with these topics. and that you know, yeah, I think yeah, that's it.
Okay, we have gone incredibly over, and we've still got three left. And what do you know what my actual proposal is? That I combine two into one question because they're very similar. And I'm going to say, Melinda, you have asked many questions in previous ones. I love you to death, but I'm wondering if you would take the sacrifice and let us not ask your questions, so we can all ensure everyone gets to work in time in the Northern Hemisphere. Is that okay, Melinda? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just say thanks for bringing up humility, James? It's great. Tough.
Thanks, Melinda. So the final very quick question, James, is it seems to be two people asking questions about this desire to open doors to have communication between human and non-human animals, and whether AI models have opened this door on a non-anthropocentric level. And another question looking at Masahiro Mori, who coined the term uncanny valley, who Tully has quoted them saying, "I believe robots have the Buddha nature within them. That is the potential for attaining Buddhahood." And do you consider robots or AI to have or could develop this capacity? Or more broadly, how do you see the agency of digital non-humans factoring into the deepening of our relationship with them? So again, questions of
I'm glad we got to
communication and
this at the end. In the book, I'm quite careful that I talk about intelligence and not about things like consciousness, in the sense that, you know, we can understand intelligence as deeply complex, relational, but material process. We can understand it, if we wish to, entirely in terms of like chemical processes happening in the body. We can be materialists about this, and as a materialist, you can admit to the possibility of all kinds of interesting things. In fact, you can understand AI as being as serious, thoughtful, brilliant, intelligent as humans, because if it can be done with a bunch of chemicals bubbling in the brain, then it can be done with a bunch of wires crossed. Like, theoretically, there's no reason it can't, if it's just a material basis. If you want to talk about Buddhas and other stuff, then you'll talk about consciousness, for want of a better term. You're talking about something that is non-material in a very different way. And there's a lot of neurobiologists, neurophysicists trying to do a huge amount of work to find a physical basis for consciousness, and they may claim to at some point, but they won't, because that's not what we're talking about. Consciousness is something that exists in a different dimension to the physical, is my belief, and we could have an argument about that, but we don't have time. It's more interesting to think about it that way, for sure. And that cosmology clearly admits the consciousness of all other beings, and of things that we might not consider sentient, like rocks or oceans or whole ecosystems, and does not preclude consciousness of machines either. But it's going to be hard to figure out exactly what that might consist of what that looks like. The primary, I think, thing when you start to talk about this greater than a materialist thinking about intelligence extending up into consciousness and things like that, is what you're talking about is a system that does radically connect us in various ways. The Buddhist philosopher, Alan Watts, you know, the phrase of his that I always come back to is that we do not come into this world, we come out of it, like leaves on the tree or waves from the sea. That we're all fundamentally connected to something deeper. And you can go through the whole life not caring about that or thinking about that, or you can make it the center of your life. Relations with other creatures and other beings is a form of making it central to one's life. It's also the only way in which we repair the damage that we've done, because our insistence that we are all separate individuals, species, disconnected in all these fundamental ways that a purely materialist understanding kind of implies, has led directly to the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in the present moment. I don't know whether AI has a consciousness. but my my personal cosmology fully admits the possibility, and that's kind of up to me, right? Because I also get to define what I think consciousness is. You do too. We all do. We can choose which cosmology we want to apply to these things, because they don't belong to the domain of rationality and scientific knowledge, or even to the physical dimension in which we perceive our spending most of our time. They belong to something else. And what I would simply ask is that more of us choose the cosmology which has chance of healing those relationships directly in the present moment, than ones that seek to kind of further divide and like bore us, which is mostly the cosmology of present AI, but could be something radically different.
Wow, what a great ending to a massive Q&A. I think you answered 15 questions in that marathon. Well done.
Some of it made sense. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. For those of us who are left, can we unmute our mics and give him a fantastic clap and thank James again for your generosity in staying back and answering so many questions. Really fantastic. Thank you everyone who's come to the series and for all your questions and thoughts. And this will be up along with related resources in the next couple of days if you want to return to it. So thanks everyone, and we'll hopefully see you again at another event soon. Sign up to the newsletter and you can keep abreast of any other events that we'll be hosting. Thanks everyone.